Hey everyone, welcome back to No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. I'm your co-host Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief of iPolitics, joined my co-host Brian Storseth, the publisher here at iPolitics. I have a terrific panel today to delve through the latest and greatest in Canadian politics. We have Ben Woodfinden, the senior advisor and director at MBP. Ryan Adam, the Executive Vice President at Wellington Dupont, and Aya Dufour, our major projects reporter here at iPolitics. Thanks to all of you for joining us. A lot to go through, but we got to start with the big news from Friday. The Canada-Alberta deal. Really, really interesting that we pushed past the deadline, but Aya, you would know better than I would. Feels like despite the fact that this thing went into overtime, Alberta still secured a pretty big concession from Canada. Is that a fair read of the big headline from Friday?
Definitely in terms of the rollback of the headline price. That's a big win for Alberta. But I mean, the minimum price floor that Alberta is going to have to put into its own market is a big win for Ottawa, because that puts a lot of pressure on the province to fix the market, fix the fundamentals of the market. Although you've heard from people, and I think this is part of it. This is such a complicated issue, and we have so many different prices for so many different timelines. And I think it's a very hard thing to communicate. And I think both parties can spin it in a way that makes it look like they won, right? Ottawa can say, hey, we got $130 per ton by 2035. That's the headline price. Alberta can turn around and say, well, we're not going to be imposing a minimum price floor, $110 by 2040. And we're probably going to see the price somewhere in between those two ranges. In effect, we don't actually know what the price will be at what time because of that specificity. So I think this gives a lot of room for people to argue that they've negotiated a better deal.
How about you, Ben? Do you think that's a fair read, that it's kind of, for both of them, they had to put some water in their wine, or do you think one side walked away with a bigger victory on Friday?
Yeah, I think both sides can be happy with this. I think this is kind of it's a positive sum arrangement so far in that regard. But I do think Alberta got a lot of big wins here. If I had to pick a winner out of the two, I think it's Alberta. Obviously, the Friday focus was on the carbon pricing and the potential pipeline stuff. You think about the rollbacks have already happened. The oil and gas cap, right, that they agreed to before. So there's a kind of cascading series of wins and concessions that the Alberta government got. And then on the kind of pricing thing itself, I do think Smith called this herself a concession, but I think what they've actually done is they've reset. This is not just an Alberta-Ottawa deal, right? It's ultimately now a kind of completely reset national pricing system that's going to affect other provinces too. Anyone that kind of has been following this stuff knows that the issue with the old tier system that Alberta had was basically the way that credits that kind of undercut and flooded the market, so it lowered kind of like real value and real actual price. They fixed that. There's now a price floor on the credits we don't have to get into all the details of what they announced, but I actually think you look at it and it's a pretty I think it's a pricing system that actually might work, and actually other provinces, places like BC and Quebec, are really going to be impacted by this too and have to change their systems, I think. But I think if that's Smith's major concession, and then if there is ultimately a project that comes out of this in a year or so, and she's got definitive timelines attached to this now that the Prime Minister gave her, I have a hard time not seeing how it will, especially from a kind of policy side. Both sides did well, but I think Alberta ultimately came out to this looking very good.
Yeah, Ben raises a great point about how, it was kind of reset this the national discussion around these issues. We see Scott Moe already coming out of the woodwork saying, hey, maybe that could be a template for Saskatchewan. Ryan, if this is kind of a brave new world for the carbon pricing regime, it's stronger or weaker, as a result of this? Has Danielle Smith masterfully, outmaneuvered the federal Liberals on this? Or again, are we in a situation where, sure, it's changing, but that does not necessarily meaning it's getting weaker or stronger?
Well, I look at it from a couple of directions. Obviously, the policy side of it, Alberta is opting in, which is a success for the federal government. There was an imposed carbon backstop on Alberta during much of the Kenney years, and those citizens were getting checks, and we were challenging the constitutionality of all of this in court, and it was a fairly hot button issue in Alberta specifically, even though I will remind folks that Alberta was the first jurisdiction to bring in a price on carbon back in 2008, the tier system, all of that. The politics of it are fascinating and where I would like to take the conversation, because, it seems to me the Prime Minister is sort of resigned to being all in on the stay in Canada portion of the separatist side of things, and he's willing to put himself pretty far out there on a limb to ingratiate himself to the industry and to the province in a way that I obviously would not have seen the previous prime minister have done. And frankly, has resulted in a dismantling of most of the Trudeau era sort of climate policies, which is something I'm interested to hear from kind of Trudeau holdovers about how they genuinely feel about the sort of dismantling of this. But what I do think to the net positive is it is putting a bit more certainty around the entire ecosystem and conversation around major projects, which is good for investment. It's good for oil and gas companies to be able to predict and prescribe future action on it. But the prime minister got a win insofar as Alberta is participating and the political talking point has been removed, no pun intended. But as far as who got more out of the deal, it's pretty clear that Alberta got almost everything they were asking for.
Your mic.
Sorry, one thing I was going to say, Ryan, is you bring up the prospect of the court challenges. And one thing I have flagged was from a story on Friday was that the PM basically said, look, I don't want to be in court dealing with this kind of stuff consistently. So I understand the angle being like, well, you want to kind of quell that separatist threat, but is that a bigger kind of end goal for the PM there, being that mindset of we can't afford to keep having these, provincial squabbles or intergovernmental squabbles? Getting that certainty is a big deal for just in general, as of course we face this existential threat from the Americans.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak as a kind of an Albertan, but like this sort of Ottawa-Alberta fight is just so exhausting at this point. Like we are facing, I think as a country, a fairly serious threat from our southern neighbor, as well as the geopolitical world when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz and some of the other conversations going on in Europe vis-a-vis Russia and other places. Like it's time for Canada to sort of come together, in my view, and try to take on the rest of the world rather than fight each other. And so I think the Prime Minister is where most of the country is, which is rather than fight each other around jurisdictionality, let's work together in as many ways as possible to kind of accomplish the collective goal. And I think Premier Smith is banking on the fact that some of these concessions will quell the separatist movement in her party and frankly in her province. And I'm not as convinced of that as maybe others are, but I do think from the Prime Minister's perspective, saying, rather than fighting each other in court, let's negotiate and meet in the middle is a seemingly reasonable and practical way to approach things. I think Ben spoke about Saskatchewan and obviously Ontario and Quebec being kind of on their back foot now, having to adjust. But I do think that these individual conversations the Prime Minister can have with these premiers can hopefully lead to a bit more of a grand bargain, because, it wasn't 2 years ago where a lot of this stuff was in place and all these regimes were imposing backstops and things of that nature. So interested to see how the Prime Minister continues this approach with a province like British Columbia or the province of Ontario or places where there's more stringent climate policy. But a good first step on the climate front.
Yeah. What do you think, Brian? Do you think, to Ryan's point, that this is going to, Alberta-Canada relationship, and maybe as a corollary to that, you think it's actually going to quell that separatist sentiment in that province, or is that kind of like baked in right now, about 20-30% of the population?
Well, look, I think this is a good step. I think you can't understate the importance of Canada working well for all provinces, including Alberta, to help dismantle some of that separatist feeling. I think is important. But I actually would frame this a different way. I think this was a win for Canada. I think when you look at it, Canada is always better when you have a strong Alberta united in the Confederation. You look at the recent economic update, $11 billion in extra money coming into the federal treasury came from increased oil prices that were drive 85% from the province of Alberta. I think Alberta, Saskatchewan playing ball and not in constant court challenges makes it easier for us to represent ourselves as an energy superpower in a time when that's needed in the world. I think this is a win moving forward. I'm interested to see how the Conservatives are going to respond to this. They seem to be a little on their back foot on it, but this is a good first step.
Yeah, I want to get Aya and Ben on this. Let's talk about who maybe is perhaps losing in this deal. Kind of environmentalists, Ryan alluded to the more climate conscious folks, even in the Liberal caucus. Is there anything that you can kind of point to that kind of act as a bit of a silver lining for those folks? Stephen Guilbeault quit the Liberal cabinet when this deal was first announced. So you got to leave caucus now. Like, is this that bad or that toxic for that kind of brand of politics?
I'm not sure. I heard some, very loud environmental voices be disappointed with, someone would say, like, reduced effectiveness of carbon pricing to attain climate goals, like emission reduction goals. But as I've also heard some people acknowledge just how difficult it is for Mark Carney to negotiate with the oil patch right now, given the international climate, and then also with Alberta using separatism as a negotiation tactic. It's trying to find the balance between putting in place a system that's going to actually work, because I think the problem with the Trudeau era carbon framework was that industry never really took it seriously, just because there was so much controversy around it. I don't think anyone really seriously looked at their balance sheet and put in like $170 by 2030. And I think now we have a more serious, attainable benchmark, if you will. I don't know if it'll impact Quebec. I was actually kind of surprised to hear Ben say that, because my understanding was that this framework is kind of aligns with the system that we see that Quebec has with California. And of course, we've heard BC say that they're in direct competition with Alberta, so that might be a different case. But I don't know. I find this was really hard. The big bargain here is, yes, you can build a new pipeline if you build Pathways carbon capture. Lots of incentive in this agreement to build carbon capture. Like, the companies who build it will have looser stringency rates. So that means that every year they're going to have a lower amount of emissions that they have to reduce compared to other companies. So like little details like that to incentivize. But the project of carbon capture, Pathways in itself, seems to have been scaled back somewhat. When the companies initially pitched this project, they were talking about 40 megatons of carbon capture. And in this agreement, we're looking at 16 megatons over like a 3-time period phase. One of the phases, the project would only be required to capture 6 megatons, and companies could find other strategic ways of reducing emissions that have nothing to do with carbon capture. So there's like a lot of flexibility there, but it does seem like the project or the scope or the scale of the project has been reduced somewhat. And that was sort of a big part of the bargain to allow for 1 million barrel pipeline a day. I don't want people get lost in the megatons and the numbers, but basically, I think you guys understand the point that I'm trying to make here about, like, I don't know if we've struck that bargain. I also wanted to say, when you guys were talking about, not being in court all the time, I do find that this agreement is very interesting in the way that it accounts for court challenges, right? There's this whole part about, we know that the clean electricity regulations are making their way through the courts, that there could be eventually like a Supreme Court look at this. And it says, no matter what happens in this case, the carbon pricing agreement will stay. And I think that's huge for regulatory certainty. We also had this part about, who's going to be responsible for paying out the contracts for differences, like that insurance policy that we're going to see the carbon framework stay in place. And, they account for what happens if the tier system in Alberta is repealed, or what happens if the federal benchmark is eventually repealed. And they account for all these potential legal outcomes. And I think that's super important and a well-done, well-designed agreement, part of the agreement.
And Ben, I'm curious, Brian kind of mentioned that the Conservatives might be on the back foot on this issue, considering the concessions being out, considering the fact that it seems, even despite, the issues that Aya's flagging, it seems like they're signaling support for a pipeline. If you were, advising Pierre right now, what would the advice be on how do you approach this issue that seems to even have support from Danielle Smith at this time?
Well, look, I think it's the opposition is always going to be in a bit of a bind on something like this, right? They do want some, they want a pipeline too. So it appears Poilievre's doesn't keep that secret. Then the question is who accomplishes it. I mean, I think if you listen to what they say, I think they're making a kind of calculated bet that even with some of the progress that might have been made on this deal, I think if they're gambling, I think they probably guess that this pipeline's probably still not getting built. That seems to me to be kind of their calculation. You can agree or disagree with that. Ultimately, time will tell. Look, I think if Carney, if they do get this pipeline, if there's a shovel in the ground by September 27, whatever the date that the Prime Minister said, if there is kind of if it is being built by then it's it's undeniably it's a victory for the Prime Minister. I don't think there's any way around that for the Conservatives, but if there isn't a shovel in the ground by then, if it gets held up, if it also gets held up in the courts for other reasons, the one thing that the one question on this that I really don't think any of the kind of negotiations that have happened so far have kind of given any clarity to is kind of the broader kind of consultation, what's going to happen on that front, and that can easily end up in the courts and spend a long time there. And I don't think there's not much in any of these agreements that's really kind of provided a ton of clarification on that and how that's going to work. So obviously you've got kind of provincial opposition in BC as well. So, there's there's a clear potential win for this down there if the Conservatives this doesn't get built, or if there are kind of more and more delays. And I think that's probably the kind of gamble that they're taking. Now, again, whether it pays off on their own, only time will tell. But I don't know what else they could do, quite frankly. Right? They've been supportive of parts of the, they helped pass C5. That they've been supportive when they can of kind of certain pieces of legislation that led to this point. But I think ultimately none of this will matter. I don't even think the kind of border agreement matters ultimately in 5 years until we know the outcome of pathways and this potential pipeline. I think we're getting closer, but I still think ultimately whether this is a success for anyone will depend on whether there's actually something that gets built at the end of the day.
But that's a good point, Ben. And we saw the Conservatives in the fall kind of try to push the government on this issue, maybe accusing them of being a bit too cutesy with their language and trying to be support for a pipeline, but not really. Ryan, do you think the fact that the government has taken this step, they are, to Ben's point, sure, they're signaling their support for it, but they're still in this weird kind of fuzzy state where until that pipeline gets built, they don't get to take credit for it. And at a certain point, are we going to be in a position where, Mark Carney is going to start wearing this? Like, he needs to champion this. He needs to push through the potential court challenges and the opposition in BC. Like, at what point does it become Mark Carney is the pipeline champion, not just the one who's like, sure, I'm okay with it, provided you do X, Y, and Z.
I mean, as a former Trudeau PMO staffer, are we allowed to take credit for pipelines now? That's a new memo for me. I wasn't even sure a pipeline was built. I can't remember who built it. If you go to Alberta, it just magically arrived one day, fully funded. We don't remember who paid for the bill, but there's a lot of collective amnesia, so I'm willing to give everybody a whole pass on that. Listen, to be honest with you, the two dates that matter really in the real world, not in hypothetical pipeline land, is this fall for Alberta and the separatist vote, and next fall for the Prime Minister. When it comes to the Alberta-Canada MOU, those are the two dates I'm watching. Submitting the proposal by October the 1st of this year, there's a political calculus being made that will suck some of the oxygen out of the separatist vote on October the 19th. So that's, to me, kind of the first angle. Still no proponent, still no kind of coastal First Nations support. They talk a good game on First Nations consultation, but that's rife with risk, as my colleagues have spoken about already on this. The Prime Minister is riding a very tight timeline, so any kind of bobble or any sort of misstep on any of this exposes him to political criticism, which I think is right, because, the brief history of all this is you have SIA 2012 brought in by Harper, where they rolled back a bunch of those pieces. Then Trudeau, I think in an attempt to assuage everyone and bring everybody along, added a bunch of these things, the tanker ban, which we haven't mentioned, some of the impact assessment modifications, some of these other things. And it subsequently, I don't know if it did more good than harm or more harm than good, but it definitely extended some of those processes. And now we see Carney trying to roll it back, but I do think, is exposing himself to some legal challenges. So that first date is pretty key. I'm watching to see who actually steps up. I've heard rumors of Enbridge and some other oil and gas companies potentially adding themselves to that proponent package there. And then the next year will shovels actually get in the ground by September 2027. I would like to see it happen. I'm extremely skeptical it will happen, but shovels in the ground is just a word. Does that mean all environmental permits are given? Does that mean all court cases are resolved? I think the Prime Minister has given himself a little latitude, but I personally thought it was going to be 2 years. 1 year is extremely ambitious, but I've made this point before. This Prime Minister continues to act like someone who doesn't care to run again. He's trying to do this in a time frame that is on business timeline and on geopolitical timelines rather than on political timelines. So I'm going to enjoy watching him try.
But Ryan, I have a question for you, and you certainly, when it comes to pipelines and major projects, are one of the more knowledgeable people in the country on it. But do you not find it a little surprising that Trudeau built a pipeline and became less popular in Alberta in doing so, while Carney is going down this path, is seemingly building up more and more goodwill through the whole process?
Boy, how much time do we have? I think, let me just start with present day. I think Carney is getting credit because he hasn't had to make any decisions yet. So it's always nice to be the politician who hasn't had to break anybody's heart yet. So I think he's riding that wave. I do think Trudeau is viewed as largely negative towards the oil and gas industry, even though his actions may be different than how his words were interpreted. Whereas Carney for now is saying every nice thing he can in Calgary about the oil and gas industry. And he's got the pom-poms painted the right color. And he's doing the Calgary Chamber of Commerce rounds, and I bet you he'll go to Stampede and be. So there's a bit of vibes versus reality going on there. But I also think we can't ignore what's changed in the world larger than Canada, right? Like the Trump of it all, the Strait of Hormuz of it all, the geopolitics of it all, I think has sharpened everybody's pencil here. So I think Trudeau, for last name reasons and other reasons, was always going to be the villain in Alberta. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, but I think that Carney is really trying to show good faith to Alberta and the oil and gas industry so far, and we'll see if it is dictated by action. Like I think Ben mentioned C5, and I know you and I have talked about the First Nations piece of it. How ready and willing are you to use federal emergency powers to sort of bulldoze communities that are no? So the proof is in the pudding there, Brian. But am I surprised a guy with the last name Trudeau is vilified in Alberta? No, I'm not.
I was going to say, Ryan, you want to talk about the memory spans? I saw, I think, a couple of Liberal MPs share this like slides on like Instagram being like, here's how we're working to lower your bills. We're getting rid of the consumer carbon tax. I wonder who put that in. Like, I don't know. It's funny how cyclical or non-cyclical.
The world's changed quickly. That's for sure.
Right. But, I think one thing, you talked about how there's so many depending factors on this and how we're influenced by global events. Or something I want to ask Aya about is when you're talking about a new pipeline, sure, these things matter on like an intense short-term level, but what are you considering? Aren't you considering like what the oil prices are going to be in 40 years, like to reap some value? So does it really matter that right now Donald Trump is disrupting? Does it really matter right now that the Strait of Hormuz is closed? It probably won't be that way in 20, 30 years down the line. Like, talk to me a bit about the kind of decisions that have to be made on that level when it comes to making an investment decision.
Yeah, I mean, when we started off the year before the Iran war, most market analysts were predicting an average price of $60 a barrel for 2026, which is sort of the price that most oil patch operations need to break even. So now, obviously with the Iran war, prices are a lot higher. If we were to see a resolve to that conflict, like today, we would still see higher prices for at least the remainder of the year. But 2027 is a bit of a question mark, and 2028 certainly, and then beyond as well. So if I'm an investor and I have to look into 10 years of a forecast here, this is a big gamble, no matter which way you look at it, especially because, yeah, of course, we have this narrative about energy sovereignty and energy independence and all that. But then there's also the very real movement towards renewable everywhere around the world that's going to shape demand, regardless of the narrative that we have being, having our own sovereign energy supply. So that's why when I see such a quick timeline, that we could have shovels in the ground by 2028, I'm like, really? They're going to put their money on the table like that? Because that's a lot of money. It's, for an asset that might end up being stranded in 15 years. And that's the other thing, right? It's not governments who build projects, it's companies. So government can put up as much goodwill as it wants and it can regulatory streamline the shit out of it. It's not ultimately what's really going to make the balance here. It's about whether companies think that they can make money.
We won't know those decisions. And, Ryan, you were alluding to how some companies, are already kind of testing the waters out. But, and maybe, forgive my ignorance here, but I feel like we've been talking about this pipeline project for the past 2 years. How come no one's stepping forward then? Like, is it still too much uncertainty? And if so, does that kind of undermine the PM's decision making? Whereas Pierre's been saying, get rid of C69, get rid of these regulatory bills. And that's a way to kind of provide that level of certainty to the oil sector.
I don't know if Ben has or others have an opinion on it, but I certainly do. And the opinion is the oil and gas companies are going to wait for the government to build it, and then they'll take it over.
What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, to be very frank about it, I think, I don't know if I should say this, I think these companies are more than happy to, if the government's going to basically underwrite the risk of these projects, they're more than happy to wait for the government to do that. And I suspect that is the calculation of a lot of boardrooms right now and back rooms about how a potential project like this could work. Because, if you're talking about putting billions of dollars worth of capital investment into these projects where you're not expecting the return, at least for a couple of years, that'd be perfectly understandable on their part. Why, if they can find someone else to underwrite the risk for them, why wouldn't they? But I think this is, I would never claim to be a kind of expert in the intricacies of all this stuff, but I do think this is probably one of the behind-the-scenes challenges that the government's facing on this, in both in Edmonton and in Ottawa. And I think everyone knows this. Probably no one wants to say it, but I think anyone in that space is probably thinking about this and how to fix this.
We're gonna end up owning 2 pipelines. Like, come on.
I mean, why not?
Why not? Even like,
I'm dead serious. Why not? Like, if we're gonna all go through this.
Like, we're not going to put any money towards it, and now is that like out the door? Like, it felt like condition.
Don't forget, as like we're talking about the pipeline here. In this MOU, this pipeline is tied up with another project, right? In theory, it's supposed you do not get this pipeline without the Pathways project, and I think that one is a much more again, not I would never claim to be a true expert on this stuff, but the kind of the economics and the viability of a project like Pathways, we've been talking about this for years, right? And it's a complicated project. I suspect that's a project that's going to require a lot of public funding ultimately to get built as well. So, but if the future of this pipeline is tied to building the Pathways project, it's a whole other kind of calculus that goes into all this stuff.
And almost like the energy and the environment go hand in hand.
It was Prime Minister once said that. But yeah, I've been writing about that and the fact that the oil patch scene is turning on.
Yeah. I mean, I'm surprised to hear Ryan say, why shouldn't we own two pipelines? I mean, you'd be comfortable with that kind of risk on the public purse?
I mean, it's going to make on average $3 to $5 billion.
You don't know that.
We just announced a sovereign wealth fund where we're inviting Canadians to invest their hard-earned money into projects that will benefit Canada. Why not copy and rinse and repeat on TMX and continue to enrich ourselves as Canadians, right? I mean, I take your point on stranded assets 10 years from now, and certainly the plucky little $7 billion pipeline we were supposed to build ended up costing 35. When something generates that kind of revenue year over year, that to me can solve a lot of problems when it comes to our social safety nets, when it comes to our increasingly complicated relationship with the US, where 99% of our oil used to go, and other things. So, when you're thinking about investments, oil pipelines are not bad investments.
No, but they're a risky one.
That can be solved by the government.
But no, because they're risky because of the price on the global market, which has nothing to do with domestic policy in Canada, right?
Yeah,
like we frame ourselves as an energy superpower, but Russia as an energy superpower, Saudi Arabia as an energy superpower, Qatar as an energy superpower. But,
the oil is more valuable out of the ground than in the ground, though, right? No matter what the price of oil is.
Okay.
And the reality is I've talked to people at the UAE. Part of the reason they're leaving OPEC is because they're seeing a global increase in energy prices for the next decade or longer. And they want to increase their output by 1 million barrels a day. And don't want restrictions on that. I think, down the road, there could be a diminishing asset, but it's certainly not in the near future I don't disagree with Ryan on this one. Surprises me maybe more than anybody, but, because
you should try it more often. It works.
The other thing that nobody's that we're not talking about enough is who else, with Section 35, the consultation process, only government has any kind of certainty in which that's going to get done with. And I don't see any private company wanting to put themselves through that process again till it's done.
That's fair. I would kind of note, though, it does seem like we're getting to this weird, spiral where everything we were talking about 5-10 years ago is out the door. We were talking about increased, adoption of renewable technology, of renewable energy. This pipeline that we built to the West Coast was supposed to help our transition to lower emissions. So I think to Aya's point, 10 years from now, maybe having a totally different conversation, or is the tide just permanently turned against, these sorts of energy alternatives? You would imagine a conflict in the Middle East, much like in the 70s, would kind of spur greater adoption as opposed to doubling down on our reliance on oil. I don't know what to make of that. To Aya's point, I think it just shows how risky it is.
I mean, I said this in the last episode, and maybe I'll expand on it a little bit. Working in the news cycle, you can see what grabs people's attention for 2 or 3 months at a time, and then how quickly that changes. And, right now, I feel like we're kind of reaching the end of the news cycle interest for the war in Iran. We're not really hearing the daily updates anymore. And, there was literally an attack on a nuclear facility and we didn't even talk about it. So I'm just saying, with this year, we're going to have some weird climate patterns with, the El Nino, and then we're going to have probably some really hot wildfires. We're going to have some droughts. And I think it could be so quick, the process of bringing this back to the forefront of the political discussion. And then at that point, if that is to happen, whether it happens next year or in 2029, I think that's where the current decisions that the Carney government is making on climate is going to come and really hurt them politically down the road.
Do they need to worry about that? I'm curious what Ben and Ryan think. We keep saying, it's going to whap them in the butt one day, but the NDP is so weak. It doesn't seem like the Greens have much of a pulse. The Green caucus within the Liberal Party, I know they have one apparently, but I don't know what they're doing. I don't know if Julie DeBruzen has the authority to push back against some of these. It just seems like the potential opposition that you would think would emerge is just not there. Does it really matter?
I don't know, Ben, if you want to take
Well,
the
maybe
lead.
you go first, and then I'll.
I was just going to say, like, I do think in all of the polling that I've seen and the doors, millions of doors I've knocked and things of that nature, like, I do think the next generation does have climate change as its top 3 issue. And I do think it is. I take all your comments about the NDP seriously, but I do think it is an opportunity for them to consolidate that vote. And also on the First Nations and Indigenous relations files as well. Like, I do think the Prime Minister announcing C5 out of the gate, I know that his polling hasn't shown any sort of decline, and certainly all the other comments that have been made are entirely relevant here. But I do think that Avi Lewis does have an opportunity to speak to that kind of climate-focused voter and folks who are worried about, investing in the future rather than, as Aya said, like kind of following the pulse of today. So if I were him, I'd continue to kind of mine that territory and farm that land, if you will. But, I just think that the reason a lot of this isn't resonating so far in polling is because the average person doesn't follow the ups and downs of it the way that 5 of us do every day. B, cost of living is always paramount to most people. And when they see the price of oil at $2 everyone freaks out about their budgets. And 3, people want to see things get done. And rightly or wrongly, some of these precautionary, policies and regulatory pieces just start to sound and feel like delay after delay after delay. And I think the Prime Minister's put his finger on the impatience of the country, and that's probably why they're still with him for now.
Ben, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think something I always try to keep in mind when I think about this stuff is that I'm not normal, and that my people that pay attention like we do are a vanishingly small number of people. We should always keep that in mind. But like I do think I do find that I'm hesitant to kind of make predictions because the world changes. It moves so fast these days that I think any of us trying to, if the next election is 2028 or 29, whatever, I don't think it'll be 29, but if let's say it's a few years from now, who knows what's going to happen between now and then. So I'm hesitant to make any kind of specific prediction, but I do think there is clearly a kind of space for some sort of kind of progressive pushback on Carney that the government is leaving wide open, that Carney is leaving wide open. And I think the people around Carney and the people around him are smart enough to probably think they can get away with that for now, at least. And I doubt that they are completely unaware of that. I'm sure they are. And I think there's space outside of the party. I do think someone like Avi Lewis, for whatever people think of him, probably is the kind of guy that can galvanize progressive environmentalist types in places like the Lower Mainland and stuff like that, places like that where, he doesn't have to win. He doesn't have 20% of the vote to kind of change the potential outcome of another election, right? So I do think there's space there. But I mean, what I find more interesting right now is there clearly are, from what I can gather, from what I hear, there clearly is like behind the scenes grumbling within that caucus from a few of the more kind of progressive Trudeau Day types, but that's not manifesting in anything serious yet, right? It's, you might get the odd grumbling here and there. I will be curious to watch to see what happens with Stephen Guilbeault, and if he sticks around or going to do something, if he's going to move on, I think that'll be an interesting sign. And then one thing I'll specifically be watching, I confess I've been spending a lot of time in BC in the last few months, but there is a good chunk of that Liberal caucus that's from BC that's I think it's fair to say are kind of more of that progressive Trudeau kind of Liberal brand. And if talk of a specific pipeline becomes, if there's a real pipeline in the works, we get a proponent, we get a route, whether it's this a hypothetical northern route or whether it's one that runs along the TMX line that's also being discussed. I'll be watching very curiously to see how kind of the progressive Liberals on the West Coast in Carney's caucus, how they deal with this, how they respond to it, because I do think there is the makings of internal opposition there that I think as long as the government is Carney's riding as high in the polls as he is, it will really manifest. But there's totally a world where, what goes up must come down at some point, right? And I could see a world where the polling dips around the same time that some of this stuff is coming to a head. And all of a sudden, what looks like a very stable, strong position for the Prime Minister becomes a bit shakier. And like I said, I'm hesitant to make predictions, but I don't think we should assume the world is fixed in stone right now. And things will change between now and whenever the next election is.
Ben, you bring up a great point about BC, and it's kind of my simplistic read, not being from that province, is it seems like it's a bit of a powder keg where you have those forces on the left who are pulling even further into that opposition to new pipeline development. Then you have the right wing of that province moving even further right. A lot of strong language around UNDRIP and recognizing of Aboriginal title. And you seem to have David Eby in the middle of all this. So for people who are better more well versed with BC politics. If you're a Liberal, what do you do? Do you kind of cater to that left wing, or do you try to, maybe hear some of those concerns and move further to the right? And if you don't make a decision, you end up becoming a David Eby figure where you're stuck in the middle and your popularity keeps declining from the polls that we've been seeing. I don't know, Ryan or I or Ben or Ryan, anyone wants to take that one on?
I mean, I think nowhere is a balanced conversation more appropriate or important than in British Columbia, right? Like, I wouldn't categorize British Columbians as anti-resource development. I would categorize them, I know this sounds like a bumper sticker, but like, they're in favor of responsible resource development. They definitely want to protect the coastline. I mean, they want to produce jobs. They want to navigate, which is increasingly becoming a very unpredictable First Nations and Indigenous conversation. The DRIPA conversation there. There's modern treaty nations all over. There's a whole series of different variables in the First Nations conversation in British Columbia. But I do think like the average British Columbian in the polling that I've seen and conducted and participated in, like, they just want to know that their risk that they perceive to be taking is going to be worth it, not only to themselves, but also to the country. So the Prime Minister heading to British Columbia after spending the weekend with Premier Smith in Alberta is, I think, a smart move for him, because as we can all count, there's a lot more conservative or a lot more Liberal MPs in British Columbia than in Alberta. But also the Premier of British Columbia is in the blender right now on multiple fronts, as I has mentioned. So is there a BC Canada MOU in the works where BC can extract value, and then who's the next province after that, et cetera, et cetera? It's all increasingly interesting to watch out in British Columbia, but I do think that British Columbians are looking for someone to kind of reassure them that the risk they're willing to take for resource development is going to pay off in the end.
I know we're kind of running at the end of it, so I do want to get to our last topic, which is the, sideshow that we saw in Scarborough Southwest the other week. So we know that Nate Erskine-Smith was hoping to use the nomination for the Ontario Liberals as a leaping pad to a provincial leadership run. That got thwarted with him narrowly losing, and that sparked a whole level of accusations about the integrity of that race. And you've been on the ground, you know how these things go. What do you make of the fact that this has kind of exploded into this inter-party turmoil? Is there any legitimacy to what Erskine-Smith is saying? Like, what's your read on what we're seeing with the Ontario Liberals?
Well, I think this is a bad look on the Ontario Liberal Party. I mean, I think that's a pretty basic take on it. Like, at the end of the day, I would have all sorts of questions on why Nate Erskine-Smith's team decided to run in a nomination before running for the leadership, and wiseness of that decision. But I don't think it can be at all debated that this is a disaster for the Ontario Liberal Party, and it's making them look pretty inept. I do think that the Premier can and should stay out of it while your opposition's burning their own house down. No need to jump in and get yourself singed in the meantime. But I think the government should just sit back and watch this continue to implode. My question is, he still an MP? Did he resign his seat? I thought he was resigning his seat. Are we having a by-election there or not? I mean, lots of questions. More questions than answers.
Yeah. Reminds me of what the Chinese proverb, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. But Ryan, one thing I heard from people outside Nate camp was he put the party in an unfair position by announcing he was going to run for leader and then seeking the nomination. Is it fair to say that the party couldn't name him the candidate, point him the candidate after he announced that he was running for leadership? Like, it would just look like they're taking sides? Or do you think, to Nate's point, the party's kind of working against them? There've been paid staff showing up at his opponent's event, and the person who beat him, no disrespect, is not like a former MPP or someone with, this big gravitas. It's, someone who ran for the party, I think, at the last election, got pretty sound to eat. Like, what do you make of that kind of inter-party turmoil?
Of course. I mean, if you're going to go put your neck on the line, of course, everybody looking to run against you is going to help the other guy in the nomination. It's pretty basic. It really makes you question his capacity to run the province if he can't figure his way through a nomination process like this. At the end of the day, it is what it is. It's pretty basic decision making. Ryan, you've been on the ground with these things. Would you ever run for a nomination and announce it before your leadership race? Like, it seems silly.
What a gift to the premier these morons are. What an absolute gift. Doug Ford should go to church every Sunday and thank God for Nate Erskine-Smith and his collection of Twitter accounts, because holy cow, what a mess. Like, I live in Scarborough Southwest. First of all, good on the guy who beat him. That guy did the work, sold the memberships, got his vote out. That's democracy. It's not Twitter fiat. I'm de facto the leader now because I announced it in a carefully curated Twitter video. I actually knocked on the doors. I sold. You may not know his name. I don't know his name, the guy who won, but I do know he will do the work. I cannot say the same for Nate. Like, this whole thing is a mess. And I left a word out of that sentence that is my favorite word, but it is an absolute mess. Like, this guy is the Schrodinger's cat of politics right now. Is he an MP? In what riding? Is he an MPP? In what riding? Is he the leader? In what, like, you know, he's just all over the map. At this point, he just needs to stop and go away. And the people around him need to stop and go away and just like let the Ontario Liberal Party like clean itself out from all these actors that have led this party into a side of a mountain for what, like 2 or 3 elections now at this point. Like, it all smells like that's that smell. It's pre-Liberal Party before Trudeau in 2013. Infighting. Is that the swift aroma of infighting I smell? Yes. Is that the hyphenated Liberal I smell? You bet. Familiar. Is it the same people? Yes. Like, ultimately, whomever becomes the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party has a huge opportunity to become premier based on recent polling, based on just the length and longevity of the Ford government. But by all means, continue to screw it up in apocalyptic proportions. My goodness.
Do you think is this something that's going to have a lasting wound if they don't clean up shop?
Yeah, look, it's for once, it's nice to be on the opposite side of this. Usually it's my side that are doing this kind of internal imploding and infighting. So it's fun to be an observer for once. Look, I don't think it's a good look for the Liberal. I don't think anyone comes out of this looking particularly good, right? I think the Doug Ford is the one who benefits the most from all of this, and I think he's been wise also to kind of mostly. I'm sure there's differing opinions internally there, but I think he's largely kind of doing exactly what we said. That he's kind of just staying out of it and letting them eat themselves on this. And I think they've still got time. Like it's what is fascinating to me about this is like clearly, you know, that party was on its knees after 2018. It's taken a few. Like it's always going to take when you're dealt a blow that crushing. It takes more than one cycle to recover usually, right? And we're getting now, you know, towards one. We'll be getting into that kind of time when people naturally get fatigued of the government. Whenever the next election is Ontario, the Premier, or if it's still Premier Ford, he'll have been there for a long time. You would assume that the next election would be the time for the Liberals the Ontario Liberals to make that comeback and be ready to kind of form government. That there's clearly a lot of work to be done between now and then. That if they're going to be in kind of fighting shape for that, I think there's, you know, it probably is like a. I'm following it again, kind of as an outsider, not as a partisan liberal. I've got to think that the leader of that party is a pretty appealing job to a lot of people these days, because there's a very good chance if you win that leadership, you're going to be the next premier of Canada's largest province. You know, when the higher stakes probably makes it more competitive in some ways, but yeah, stuff like this just makes the party not look ready for prime time, right? And there's still lots of time between now and then, and you know, if they pick a new leader and they pull the ship together, and this will all be forgotten in a few years, I suspect. But if this is a sign of things to come, then yeah, Doug Ford will be the man that benefits the most from this.
I would just make one comment, Marco. Like normally at this point in a mandate, we experienced it in our mandate. We got the majority after 2 minorities. It was around this many years in. When you're out there doing transformative things with your majority government in the first couple of years, you know, Calandra's making big changes in the education system. Lecce is being very transformative in his portfolio. Downey's presenting to the Supreme Court. You've got all these things going on where the government's actually making big moves. Normally they dip in the polls more than they have, but back in 2013, 14, the Liberal Party had a pretty, unfortunately for us, a pretty mundane leadership race in which one guy came in and cleaned the floor with everybody, and there wasn't a lot of controversy. and allowed them to kind of guide and pick up on some of the things that the Harper government was doing. You're not seeing that here. I mean, I know Premier Ford's gone down in the polls somewhat, but for the things that they're doing and the changes they're making in Ontario, they've been able to coast through it because the opposition's not able to actually collectively attack them on anything and get their act together, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. I mean,
Can I
Ryan,
just say one last thing about this? Like, as a former political staffer, it was not about me and my super awesome idea and opinion. And one of the most infuriating things about all of this is that there are a bunch of people not named Nate Erskine-Smith who are entering the chat, as it were, and making it all about themselves, whether or not this thing or that polling or this. Like, just stop. Just stop. Like, let the leader speak or the candidates speak. Like, there's so many inflated egos in this conversation that it's just detrimental to the whole process, right? Like, ultimately, I think that party, as my colleagues here on the panel have said, like, have an incredible opportunity. But if they continue to make it about this sideshow as opposed to keeping the focus on Doug Ford and his accomplishments and track record, then, like, this is just treehouse politics. It's destined to go nowhere.
Can I just say one thing quickly? It's funny that, you know, we're talking about Ontario. We haven't even mentioned the official opposition here, and you know, it is remarkable to me how little kind of airtime that Merit Styles and NDP get. I don't actually think that's necessarily all their fault. Ontario is a uniquely hard place, I think, to be in opposition because there's just the media landscape. It's very hard to break through the media landscape. Ontario media really isn't a thing in the same way it is, say, kind of Alberta or Quebec. Often they're just going to get subsumed into national media. It is a hard place to do opposition and to get attention, especially when you have a majority government. But I mean, the Liberals are managing to get some of this attention right now. They're managing to be in the news, but it's not for the right reasons, right? This is not the reasons you want to be in the headlines. And if this is the only thing people are hearing about from a potential different government down the road, this is not an impression that's going to stick well in voters' minds. It could all be completely forgotten in a couple of years. I suspect it will be, but it should be a warning sign to anyone in that party that if they think they're just going to cruise into a government because voters get fatigued with the full government, I'm sure the full government would welcome people to be thinking that way.
no, that's a good point. And again, the NDP seemingly is lost in the shuffle, just like it was in the last election too, but they're still emerged as the official opposition. I know we're tight for time, so I'm just going to move to our last segment, let everyone ask or chime in with something they're looking forward to in the week ahead or something that caught their eye in the week that just passed. I'll start with you, Brian.
Thank you, Marco. Look, I'm really interested to see as Parliament starts coming back into session, the opposition leader's response to all of the news that the Carney government has created in the last week and a half. I think it's going to be interesting to see and not just Pierre, where Blanchette is going to go with some of this stuff, where Ovid Lewis, who I think has real opportunity here, where he's going to go, and if he gets any traction on his response to some of the announcements around pipelines, MOUs, and everything else going on. So I'm really interested to see in the next week or two where that's going to go. I think it's going to dictate a little bit of where the national conversation goes.
That's a good point. How about you, Ryan?
I'm watching British Columbia today. The Prime Minister and the Premier. I'm interested to see if there's a tone or content shift in that relationship. It has been the most curious relationship for me, given the political kind of calculus there. The Prime Minister seems to be much closer with Premiers Moe and Smith than he does Premier Eby. So I'm interested to see what comes out of that time spent in the Lower Mainland by the Prime Minister today and whether or not that results in sort of any meaningful sort of concessions for the province of British Columbia.
Yeah, no, Premier Eby, it seems like his whole spiel right now is like, come on, guys, like throw me a bone here. Like you guys are focusing on everyone but our issues. So wonder if he's going to be heard out by the PM. How about you, Ben?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of repeat what I was saying earlier. I'll be with the House coming back next week. I'll be very curious to watch some of these maybe more progressive voices inside the Liberal caucus, people like Stephen Guilbeault, Gregor Robertson, the former mayor of Vancouver. See if there's any probing of kind of how they're feeling about any of this stuff. They've been pretty quiet, and discussions are going behind closed doors and not necessarily the things they're going to say publicly for now, at least. But I will be curious to see how much, if they do get pushed by whether it's by media, whether it's by opposition, Because I do get the sense, at least in kind of the pages of certain newspapers and online, there is the kind of the beginnings of what I would call like progressive opposition to this government, and the space is being left open. But so far, I don't see any kind of signs it's kind of concrete and made its way into the real world. So I think signs of just more a bit of caucus discontent if it does bubble, if Stephen Guilbeault decides to walk away and step down or whatever he decides to do. I think you'll get signs here of whether there's any kind of potential growing space for that kind of progressive opposition to Carney. I think you'll start seeing it soon if it is going to emerge anytime soon.
That's a good point, Ben. If not now, then when?
Yeah.
How about you, Aya?
Well, yesterday, so Tuesday, we saw Mark Carney take credit, or the Major Projects Office take credit for breaking ground at Renewable Graphite in Quebec. It's almost kind of like a déjà vu because Carney did exactly that at the Contrecoeur expansion of the Montreal Port Authority, like just a few weeks ago. Same thing, like, look, 6 months after the referral, we're beginning construction, like this is going so well. And I enjoyed some of the pushback from the Conservatives on this, who were like, well, you actually just hitched your wagon to a project that was already on track. And, he did get some pushback on this, like, what did the Major Projects Office really do? And he always kind of points to the federal supports that whatever project got. But these are public funds and they're supposed to be making decisions independent of government. So I have a hard time when I hear him, sort of link his government to these federal investment decisions. But I did think it was interesting yesterday because the CEO of the mine project of Nouveau Graphite, Eric Desaulniers, he was saying, I have it on good authority that Mark Carney made all the difference here by talking to investors abroad. And that's where we landed some of our important shareholders. And they do have Italian investors, Japanese investors. So I do wonder if, this did make a difference. Maybe not in terms of Major Project Office effectiveness, but maybe the gravitas of a Mark Carney as a politician. Who knows?
I do love the idea of Mark Carney phoning up people and trying to hit them up for money. Like, how much can you throw at this graphite project, bro? That's a terrific point. For me, like Ben, I'm looking forward to the House coming back next week. I think the thing I'm looking forward to is there's some big legislative decisions that need to go across the finish line. There is a bail bill that still hasn't become law. There is C9, which I assume will create another fight in the Senate. And there's some other criminal justice legislation that I assume the government wants to pass, in addition to the Build Canada Homes Bill. Sorry, not the budget implementation. Yes, Spring Economic Statement implementation bill. They're not necessarily on a really tight timeline. They can always do these things in the fall, but you assume they'd want to get some of these measures passed. So I wonder what kind of resistance they're going to face if the Conservatives or any opposition parties, despite the fact we're no longer dealing with the minority, if they're going to push back, or is everyone going to play nice considering where the polling is? I'm very curious to see how that all shapes up in the final 4 weeks or potentially less of the spring sitting. Thank you, Brian, Ben, and Aya for joining me. Brian, thanks as always for co-steering the ship here. And thank you all for listening. We'll be here same time next week. Thank you.